Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nick Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university.
Hey, Zach, how's it going?
It's good, Nick, but I'm feeling feisty. I'm ready to fight.
Ooh, all right. Well, I'm here to fight too. Let's go. All right. So this episode this week, we're going to be talking about the fight stance in position to AI. So what it means, what are, the rationales by why some people want to take on these technologies at universities, and kind of get a sense of the trajectory that it could take as the fight position kind of grows and spreads. So where do we start with this, Zach?
So our very first writing about this, and you can find that on our blog, meltsintoair.org. Check it out. It's fantastic. Our very first post was about the three different dispositions that faculty are going to have towards AI: the embrace camp, the ignore camp, and the fight camp. And we were speculating about what that was going to be without really knowing what those things were going to fully look like. I will say, and Nick wrote a post about this as a follow-up, we were largely right about that, about where people would reside. One thing that has sort of crystallized is, what does fight mean? And that's one of the reasons we're doing this episode today.
Yeah. So what does fight mean?
So what we have seen is a consolidation around reasoned opposition to the integration of artificial intelligence in higher education. And it's taken a couple of different forms or fronts. And early on, we saw this, oh, this is artificial, or this isn't very good. I will say most of that has kind of dissipated. And the more reasoned explanations that we have, or fronts that we have people that see AI as a fundamental threat to higher education and the development of students' critical thinking. And there's some evidence to support that, including some pretty good research. And they say we need to keep it out of the classroom so that students continue to develop. There are objections to AI based on bias and environmental impact, as well as labor and copyright concerns. I'm not always convinced that everyone who is harboring those beliefs is doing so in good faith. I think oftentimes those things are just code for, here's a new thing and I don't like it.
Yeah, and try to figure out a reason why it's bad. And
yeah, I think real motivated reasoning.
There's been a lot of flurry of people posting thoughtful rebuttals to the environmental angle, and we could put those in the show notes. But from my perspective, I do study energy and environment, and I do see that way that climate change and water and nature kind of get instrumentalized, where people just use it to hammer onto something that they don't like.
It reminds me of people getting a hold of an environmental impact study because they don't want to live next to multi-unit housing, but really it's just because they don't want to live next to multi-unit housing.
Yeah. So and that's where I think some of the fight stance is. We want to understand it and take it seriously, because there's a lot of stuff in there that's really important in any of these different critiques. But Zach, you also took a view much more. We use this word a lot on the podcast, existential, but it's kind of hard to avoid in some ways. But you kind of took a different view when you were looking at artificial general intelligence. So a system of sort of agentic systems that basically become sentient or capable, like an intelligent being, and kind of projecting out in the future where, will these kinds of systems actually replace me as a worker or a human? And talk just a little bit about that angle. I think there's a fear there that people see that they're responding to.
Yeah, and we'll do probably a full episode about artificial general intelligence in higher education in the not too distant future. But this specifically in terms of fight, I think there's something here because people are really concerned about AI and job loss or job displacement. And I think understandably so. There's a real threat there, and we'll talk about that ongoing as our series continues. But that's a legitimate reason why people are throwing up objections to AI in general, and specifically in terms of higher education. And we'll talk about some different industries where people have taken actually quite firm stances because there's legitimate concern that these systems will replace the labor of humans. And that isn't just inconvenient, it's a disruption to the social order.
Yeah, so there is some aspects of this that are in the Luddite category, right? And you can maybe talk a little bit about that. But there are other, you know, differences where people are really kind of defending those core values of what it means to be human and learning and creation and ethics and things like that. So, those are really important, but some of it is around that Luddite kind of historical example. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, and I know that term gets thrown
Hmm.
around a lot. Anytime somebody doesn't buy the latest iPhone, that's what they're referred to, and somehow that's the same
Yeah.
thing as
Right. It
as
becomes a pejorative, absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
It does, and it is an oversimplification, but there is a small c conservative element of this where the technology is a threat to the sort of world that we've created, the value systems that we have established, and that then our opposition to that is a fight for preservation of something that we really care about. And oftentimes there have been backlashes to pieces of technology. And then I think more often than not, contemporaneous opposition has misread the long-term impacts of the thing. And
Mhm.
the historic example, and I've mentioned this more than once on this podcast, is there was a lot of opposition and people like smashing looms when we started to develop the mechanized looms. But then the impact of that wasn't necessarily what we anticipated because it ended up that now we all have 20 shirts instead of having two shirts,
Hmm.
right? And so oftentimes the implications of these things are a little bit hard to foresee in real time. And then in retrospect, the opposition seems silly, but maybe there was a kernel of it that actually had value.
Totally. Yeah. Um, and before we move on, I just wanted to also set for the listeners sort of some two new books that have come out that are kind of, to me, when a book comes out that positions itself as a sort of conceptual framework around an issue, I think they can and sometimes lead to, a formation of an ideology or disposition around that. So Karen Howe, who was an insider at OpenAI, has a new book called Empire of AI. And I think it's positioning as a sort of critique of these technologies as part of a long string of colonial capitalist domination. And I think so part of the fight camp is in a kind of left-wing critique of modernity, of capitalism. Like those are kind of unavoidable. And I think that is one strain of it. And then another one is Feeding the Machine, a new book coming out, or it's probably out, that really almost like in a sense go peels looks behind the curtain and wants to expose the sort of human impact, the actual labor that goes into creating these technologies. So I think, when more of these books come out and they get read through the circles, those will become sort of conceptual frameworks that people will also begin to apply to critiques of generative AI and LLMs and so on and so forth.
Just if I could add real quick
Yeah.
there, Nick, I am eager for a more nuanced conversation about the human labor part of this
Hmm.
from the second book that you cite from Feeding the Machine. That has been underexplored and underarticulated even among folks that are opposed to AI. And some of the anecdotes that I've heard about the human labor that's gone into that are really distressing. And so I don't know all of what I think about that yet. Lots of labor practices are bad,
Yeah.
but I am eager for a more nuanced conversation about that. So I'm excited to see that make its way into the ether.
Hmm. All right, so next we wanted to talk about and ground this in sort of like the people, especially here at universities. Well, who is fighting AI? What are the kinds of groups of people or individuals? So, of course, we have faculty critics, and that's sort of a variety of different positions on that. I can imagine, and there are artists and people in art departments and just in the artistic community in general. We saw also in Hollywood, for example, right, with writers, and I mean that huge impact going to be there. So we can expect to see more, I'm sure, activity because that leads us into unions as being one sector that is going to actually begin to challenge and take on the deployment of AI in the university, but of course in other sectors. And we also see it with our students. You know, I've read some reports or articles where students are saying, you know, I'm paying all this money to go to university, and my professors are just kind of offloading and having the AI teach me. And you know, it opens up questions about pedagogy and connection to students and debates that we've covered on this podcast and previous episodes. Let's talk a little bit though, because you and I work at Chico State, it's part of the CSU system. So we're represented by the California Faculty Association. So let's just pause there for a little bit and have a little conversation around the CFA and the movement in that area.
Yeah, so the California Faculty Association, of which Nick and I are both union members, has been a vocal critic of the partnership between OpenAI and Cal State. And it's not always clear to us how much of that is just an automatic reaction, management's for it, we're against it, and how much of that is grounded in real legitimate concerns. I have the initial or one of the initial statements from the CFA pulled up here, and I'm just going to read a brief section to give the listener a flavor of the nature of the opposition. While we recognize there are multiple perspectives on the use of AI, we have significant concerns about faculty jobs, academic freedom, intellectual property, and surveillance. Any integration and use of AI in the classroom must be led by faculty, not by administrators and tech companies. So there's a lot there that I like. I work in faculty development. I believe in faculty empowerment. One of the reasons why I love higher ed in general is being around faculty experts and learning so much from them. I've learned so much, Nick, from you about environmental impact and sociology. It's one of the reasons I got into higher ed. But the nature of their opposition is really wide reaching. In other parts of the statement, there are pretty substantial claims about the lack of consultation, about environmental impacts. It's a little bit of kitchen sink opposition.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, there's definitely a lot to unpack with the CFA reaction. What's your take on how they, or maybe I should say we, have positioned ourselves?
Yeah, I was too young when the computers were introduced to the university and the internet. I was still in, middle school or whatever when the internet came out. So I don't know. I didn't live through those transitions and transformations. I don't know if faculty unions and faculty bodies, protested against them. I mean, maybe that's something we should look up. But I do wonder about that, the deeper critique versus the dynamic that, unions have with administration and management as just a sort of baked in, like, in a sociological sense, the functions of both are to further their own interests, and they systematically disagree, right? And then eventually they kind of come to a resolution on some things. So there's some of that that's baked in, but I'm trying to, if there is going to be an institution that does protect faculty, it's going to be the faculty union, right? There's no other institution in society that's organized to protect the interest and the jobs of faculty. So I think there is a role, of course, in these conversations for unions to play, but there's so many other issues as well where we don't see movement on. There's lots of issues that faculty have had for a long time about our jobs that never get addressed by the union. And I think it just kind of in the back of my mind is what is the grounded opposition that we're talking about here? And I think that's the kind of conversation I like to have with other faculty is kind of grounding it. Is like, what is it that we don't really like? What is it that we do like? Because it's here, right?
Yeah.
It's like electricity. It's like computers. They're here, right? And so that's how I approach it now. Because I
Yeah.
mean, things can change, of course.
Yeah, Nick, and I'm glad you brought that up because it does lend itself to a broader point about the fight disposition, where a lot of people that are are opposed to AI integration in higher education, what they're really opposed to is the existence of the technology.
Hmm.
And it's something that I said, and I don't mean to be flippant about this, but like we can do a call campaign to Sam Altman and say, shut down ChatGPT. That's like we don't really have a voice in whether or not the technology exists the same way that we don't have a voice in whether or not computers and electricity exist, right? Like these things are here. The question in front of us is what do we do with the thing? So it's one of those areas where I do wish that we could disaggregate a little bit our opposition to, let's say, the technology itself from our integration of it in a higher education institution.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So what are the ways that it will become integrated? Do we have some control over that? What role does a union play? What role do autonomous faculty, administrators, people in faculty development offices? Those I think and that's happening, right? So I think that separating those different pathways out and actions out is important. I think maybe it's a little bit important to kind of then just a little quickly, like the what does motivate, the fight position? What, in our experience talking to people and even from our own ideas, what do you think motivates this?
Well, I think part of it is a defense of professional identity and autonomy. And you and I have seen this firsthand in the early days when we were doing some webinars and other pieces. We would open up a chat window and just start interacting and, get these systems to produce a rubric, an assignment guide, or student work. And the immediate reaction that sometimes people have is, "Oh, I thought that was my thing."
Hmm.
Right? Like, no, I'm the that writing that kind of stuff, producing that kind of stuff, that is my job as a professor, right? And so
Yeah.
there is a sort of an attack that these systems levy against the sacredness of what it is that we're doing and our place in the societal puzzle.
Yeah. No, I've made this point elsewhere that, you know, if you're not at a university, to understand that faculty are a small minority of people on Earth who have ever existed on Earth, and all pool of human beings who have a very specialized skill that most people don't have around writing, around speaking, around research, and so on and so forth, arts, science, you name it, right? And I think that part of that is this shows you that those maybe aren't as special, right? Because not only can other, when I look at a professor who's doing work that I can't even comprehend doing, I say, oh, wow, like they're amazing. That kind of makes me feel like, well, what am I doing over here? But now when you have a thing you type into on your computer and it's like, new models supposed to come out this year or next year, '05 from OpenAI, that's supposed to be at the PhD level in terms of its reasoning and capability. So I think that does change that there's also grounded fears about devaluation of expertise. We have episodes we've talked before about the speed of change. I think as things in society change too fast, whether it's climate change or economic crisis or political crises, like it destabilizes everybody's sense of what the future is, and it leads to uncertainty and unease. Right? I think these technologies are really personally. I mean, it does lead to that kind of anxiousness and unease about, well, I don't really actually know. I can't read the future. Like Niels Gilman had a great piece about, with the first Trump administration, basically the official future is over. This idea that we had built in our minds that there was this trajectory from Obama to Clinton to so on and so forth for people in that sphere of politics, that large scale disruptions and changes to that official future cause that uncertainty amongst people. So, um, but there's more, right? Because one of the foundational critiques, especially for left-leaning people, is around tech industry, the power of them, right? Connecting it to the power of these giant transnational corporations. What
Yeah,
else in that?
the
Yeah.
um and this obviously predates generative AI, right? Like no one really loved big tech companies outside of people, maybe even co-hosts of this podcast that have an undying allegiance to Apple. No, nobody really, is like, oh, I just go to bed every night and read stories about the founding of Oracle, right? Like no nobody. There was this episode years ago on the Weeds podcast called "Everybody Hates Big Tech" because it had
Mm,
become a punching bag for both the political left and the political right.
hmm
And then AI has sort of scrambled that a little bit, exacerbated it a bit. Nick and I wrote a piece for Inside Higher Ed about the sort of right-wing coding, both literally and figuratively, of some of artificial intelligence. But yeah, there is a structural critique. This is bound up with labor exploitation, the evilness of Silicon Valley, right? Like all that kind of stuff. And that has different saliences depending on where you're at politically, but there's no doubt that there's a powerful critique there that's grounded in some very real harms
hmm
that these technologies and companies have fostered and created, right? Like raise your hand if your life is better because Instagram existed, right? Like it's nobody.
hmm Well, maybe a couple people making $10 million a
Yeah,
year.
fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay, but that's part of the critique, right? So, widening inequalities and things like that. So, absolutely, there are real reasons. Now, I think what you and I have tried to do when thinking about the fight disposition is there's all the reasons to be against the technology. But in the work I do, I like to think about, well, what's politically possible? What are the trajectories? What are the potential outcomes if different actions are taken and different pressures are put on? So, I mean, what do you think could happen if the fight mentality gains ground on universities?
Yeah, well, you can kind of see that with some of the things that CFA is alluding to, right? Or sort of saying that they would like slowed adoption, and maybe that means increased consultation with the different bodies that that management is interacting with, faculty, students, interest groups, etc. You could have firmer boundaries around these systems. Maybe we call that regulation. Maybe that's just you're sort of fencing in appropriate use cases. But yeah, those are some places where you could imagine integration still happening, but maybe at a little bit of a slower pace. Do you have a more radical view
Well,
than that, Nick?
no, but I kind of just want to think about that a little bit more. Just to linger there, because if fight gains ground and we see slower adoption, I want to unpack that. Slower adoption by who? Because I think one of the mismatches here is that that's not going to mean slower adoption by students.
Right, that's a fair
And
point.
and I think that and also there's lots of faculty who are using these tools, right? So we can't also ignore that as well. So I think that as political movements on campuses or outside put that pressure on, it doesn't necessarily address the it's like trying to ask students to stop using the internet or electricity or driving the cars to work. I mean, there's ways that we try to encourage biking and, all these, conserve energy, do less of it, but radically like stopping it in major ways, I do think has some implications for the mismatch between how people are already actually using it. And I think one of the consequences there is those kind of splits within faculty administrators on campuses that could actually be somewhat destabilizing in terms of cohesion and governing the campus itself.
I think that's a great point. My headspace was just in the CSU AI partnership piece because we were
Yeah.
talking about the CFA piece. But one of the things that we've seen in private industry is that there's a huge adoption among people doing knowledge work, but most of it's off-label usage, right? Like people bringing their own device to work and their own AI tool and then using that to complete work that without the integration of an AI system that's sort of part of an infrastructure at work. So I think that's a
hmm
great point that fight is very uneven, and you could have a professor with a fight disposition, and they could decide I'm going to try and design assignment structures, and you could just bet that students who want to do that, that like that is going to be the locus of the fight is in between, let's say, faculty and students.
Yeah, I mean, down in the weeds here at teaching classes and running a program, I think it does raise some at the individual level where, let's say, one faculty says, AI use is banned and it's, something that we shouldn't use, and they're going to spend their time fighting it in different capacities in their class and out of their class. And maybe students say, I want to sign up for that class because I'm going to use it and I'm going to just write all my essays in ChatGPT because that professor is still using the model from 30 years ago where they're writing essays or taking exams. And that can impact programs, all the way up to, creating schisms or things that we talked about around assessment and data. And there's so many different ways that the fight will intersect with how these universities are governed. So
Well, just real quick on that,
yeah.
Nick, before we move on, I do think, and I don't want to veer into irresponsible speculation here too early, but I can even imagine on a campus like ours or another, right? Like there's some students in comm studies that could probably just as easily be a sociology major, that could just as
Hmm.
easily be a psychology major or study political science, right?
Yeah.
Like, and let's say we start to have programmatic dispositions, right? Like
Hmm.
psychology decides we are
Hmm.
fighting, and
Yeah.
comm studies is like we're AI first, right? You
Yeah.
could start to even see a sorting of students into different programs based on their own alignment with the technology. So,
Oh, for sure. And as people don't know, students already self-sort into programs for all different reasons. And one of them sometimes is actually how rigorous and how many units the major requires.
yeah,
So let's be real that there are already different ways students find majors is not just because they say, oh, sociology, I was born to be a sociologist,
right.
right? And I think it's really interesting to think about that. And just to put a point on that as well, you mentioned earlier about some studies about the use of AI in educational outcomes, but there's conflicting studies. I know Ethan Mollick, props up certain studies that actually show improved growth and learning, right? And so that's where if we're following sort of data, the data itself also becomes part of the political tool, and people are sort of like thrusting that data forward. And I think, that can lead to bad policy, that can lead to sort of political fights over how we understand reality itself. Is it, and it gets into sort of actually some of the core ideas of the university, which is supposed to be finding, some truths about the physical and social world.
So, Nick, we promised to hold each other to account here as we're getting towards the end of this episode. What is the most compelling part of the fight narrative or the fight position for you as an instructor?
Yeah. So I am somebody who studies inequality, class inequality. And I am pretty compelled by some of the dangers of unchecked corporate power, the ways that technology corporations, well, of course, the richest people in the world now draw mostly from the tech sector, right? And the biggest corporations are technology companies. So I think there are downstream effects of that, and I think that I am compelled by the argument that there is something there. There is something there that universities should work on. How much of the university do we want influenced and controlled by corporations? I think that's a really important part. And along with that is, the sort of labor angle behind the technologies themselves. What about you, Zach?
So I agree with you that the data is mixed, and I think I have no doubt that we're going to see some real motivated research studies where people are sort of massaging data to match their own political agenda in the coming years. I am real concerned about the cognitive offloading that these systems can provide and the loss of critical thinking skills that we're going to see among students. Even if you imagine those folks entering an AI empowered workforce, they're going to be less effective at every part of what it is that they do. Like even a completely reductionist, we're just here for job training and they're all going to use AI out in the workforce. The truth is, they're going to be not as good at it if they aren't as cognitively complex as the students that were coming out of our programs 5 or 10 years ago. And so I do think that, especially on a course by course basis, there is there are compelling reasons to think that we need to limit or eliminate use in some of those areas.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really productive area to have conversations on. And I just want to sort of close on reflecting on this because I think you and I, across our writing, our speaking, our work on this, is that we generally take the critical embrace camp where we're trying to figure out what these technologies are, how they can actually integrate into making the work that we do here better and different and new and relevant, right? Not relevant just to us, but to students and to society. And so that's kind of how we come with it. But we recognize that there are these threads of problems that the fight camp rightly raises that we do take seriously, of course. So, all right, Zach, you want to get us into our last segment here?
Nick, is it time for irresponsible speculation?
Oh, yes, it is.
So, one of the things that we've talked about a little bit irresponsibly, perhaps, is the possibility that somebody, and we don't mean like some professor, but some campus is going to go all in on fight. And I don't know if that looks like a chat ban, like has been proposed at some campuses. Sometimes it seems like that's what CFA, the position that they're taking. But what do you think about that? A campus that decides we are the anti-AI campus.
Yeah, lots of thoughts on that one. We both recently listened to Ezra Klein's podcast with Rebecca Winthrop from Brookings Institute. And they were talking about AI and education, mostly, K through 12 and younger kids. But they both sort of admitted on the podcast that if they have a choice, they would send their kids to technology-free schools. They both recognize that they want their kids to know the technology so they could be members of the modern world, but they thought it was super important that at a certain age that the students should be just like playing in the mud and doing art and so on and so forth, right? So maybe a Montessori type thing. But it kind of got us thinking about what would that look like if a university extended that idea that people at a university should also be, playing in the mud, if you will. And to my mind, kind of went, of course, to sort of like, kind of liberal arts, kind of left-leaning schools, maybe on the West or East Coast that really value that playing in the mud aspect of liberal education. And I can see all the reasons why they wouldn't do it and couldn't do it, but I kind of that's where I thought that sort of, we need to get touch grass and be out there learning in that way. What about you?
Yeah, it's something like that, or maybe a really boutique thing, not necessarily like traditional higher ed, but like, think about like an art or dance, Juilliard or something like
Hmm.
that. You could see them, putting up real firm boundaries around that. And, it might look real different. It might look real sort of hippie vibes of, classes are outside and there's not a screen in sight. A boarding school where there are no cell phones
Hmm.
or laptops, something like that you could see, and then you could also see a particular subset of people thinking that that's the experience that either they want or their parents want them to have. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think in if you think about higher education as a market, I mean, I can see that a market could develop on that. Uh, and it kind of goes back to that the podcast I mentioned. It's like, well, what do those students learn and do after, right? I think that's part of me, my irresponsible speculation is I just wonder, like, is that a dead end? I mean,
yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's probably a way that you could preserve some of the things that we were talking about, maybe some integrity issues along with some of the critical thinking stuff that I was talking about. But, if we think about a key part of higher education as preparation for career or whatever, I don't know what you're applying to if every class is like outside, butts getting grass stained, somebody's like gesticulating wildly and talking about Sophocles the whole time.
yeah.
I mean, I'm not dogging that. I've read a lot of Sophocles, fascinating stuff, but there's a big gap between that and getting an entry level job at a consulting firm.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the administrative and policing logistics to run an institution without generative AI, you would probably have to get rid of all technology.
That was irresponsible speculation.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintoair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintoair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nick Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintoair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.